Welcome to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. I'm talking to you on the 14th of June, 2023, and I'm talking to you from Middle Village in the borough of Queens in New York City. I've titled today's show, The McCarthy Budget, Good Politics, but is it good economics? David Stockman will be with me in the second segment of today's show to answer those questions. But I'm really happy to tell you that Scott Berdahl, founder and CEO of Snowline Gold Corp, is with me for the first time. Now, Scott is really a very interesting fellow coming out of the Yukon, has 2 degrees from MIT, it's an engineering degree from a very prestigious school, I believe out of Saudi Arabia, an MBA from a school in France and Singapore. But I've learned to know of Scott because of Quentin Henning, who was very early on an investor in Snowline and raved about Scott's abilities, and he certainly hasn't disappointed his shareholders so far, that's for sure. So really, really pleased to have him with me for the first time. Thank you so much for joining me, Scott.
Thanks for having me on, Jay. Really happy to be here.
Really great to have you, and I love that backdrop there. You're in the Yukon right now, talking to me from the Yukon. And you mentioned that you really enjoy being in nature and exploring. And yeah, well, I'm a city guy. I live in the city, and my wife wouldn't leave this place, so I'm pretty much destined to look at bricks and mortar. But I envy you from where you're sitting there now. I should mention to our viewers that your stock trades in Canada, of course, under SGD as a symbol. You can buy it down here in the States under the symbol SNWGF, which is what I've done. I have it 140 million shares, more or less, at $2.44 thereabouts in U.S. money recently, giving it a market cap of about $342 million. And a good balance sheet with $37.5 million of working capital and some pretty sound shareholders, one of which is B2 Gold, that owns 9.9%, just recently increased its holdings. And I believe Crescat Capital is also a major shareholder as well. I guess, Scott, we want to talk about the road project because there has been some fantastic news coming out of the road project. Could you just tell our listeners, our viewers about the road project, what you've accomplished so far in just 2 years, I guess? I mean, I know you were prospecting before that, but since the company's been in the public domain, you've made some great progress over the last 2 years. Talk to our listeners, our viewers, about what you've accomplished so far.
Sure. That sounds great. So Rogue is a bulk tonnage gold system. Well, I should be more specific. Rogue is a huge land area. We recently expanded it. It covers about a 60 by 30 kilometer geological feature with all these intrusions that come up through the crust or came up through the crust 90 million years ago and brought a lot of gold with them. And Rogue is targeting these intrusions, which represent bulk tonnage gold targets there. Fort Knox in Alaska is the kind of case example of these big gold systems that you just get within the intrusion. You get these sheeted quartz veins. They're very small veins, but there are tens of thousands of them, and they just run for hundreds of meters in basically every direction. And so it's a very attractive model to look for. The caveat has always been that the grades are a little low. They work for a bulk tonnage target, but they're still generally sub-gram. But what we've found in drilling into our first of many targets on the Rogue project, a zone called Valley, that we discovered a intrusion coming out of the ground there. It's about 1 kilometer in diameter, and it's got these veins, and it's got all the characteristics of a system like Fort Knox, except that it has a lot more veins, and more veins mean higher grades. And so that's been wonderful for us. I mean, it looks like a system that can really work. It's in the middle of a big, broad, flat valley. The highest grades are right near surface. It just ticks so many boxes of what you'd want to see for not just finding a mineral occurrence or an ore body per se, but a really potentially profitable discovery. And so we're very excited by it. As you mentioned, we've been on the target for 2 seasons now. We've only been a company for 2 field seasons now. We're just kicking off our 3rd field season. We have drills turning out there, and yeah, we've managed to do a lot because we've taken an approach where we know that we want to find something big. We know that we need to find something big. And so we've set a high bar where we drilled at the end of our first season, 2021, a few holes right on the edge of this system, just 4 holes, 800 meters of drilling. They returned good results for, for the classic system of this type. And so we were quite encouraged, but we took big steps out in the intrusion. Our first step out was 340 meters into the heart of this thing. And it was spectacular. We're seeing grades of up to 300 and 2.5 grams over 319 meters from surface. The top 108 meters of that particular hole averaged 4.1 grams per ton gold. And stepping out with big step outs in various directions, we're seeing comparable grades, just great continuity of mineralization, almost no internal dilution. It's just a big, it's been described very technically as a blob of mineralization, and that seems to be what it is.
Yeah, I know. Quentin Henning, I think, compared it to a bowl of soup, and you take a spoonful of soup and you know pretty much what all of that bowl of soup is going to taste like. That's not quite right, because there's a section, an area, I think maybe it's to the southwest, more or less, of this deposit that you've outlined so far. That's very high grade. I mean, like the kind of numbers you're talking about. 2 grams, 1.5, 2.5 grams, which is incredible for this kind of. What sort of grams did they run at? What sort of grades did they have at Fort Knox? And how big was that deposit?
I think the global resource there now is at around 10 or 11 million ounces of past production and remaining resource. So it's a big system. But they started with a sub-gram. I think it was about a 0.9 grams per ton. Head grade when they began mining there, and that has just gone down ever since. They started with the juiciest part of that system, and they're currently 30 years in, and they're mining 0.3 grams per ton with a 0.1 gram per ton cutoff in a gold only system. So it's pretty incredible, and it speaks to the amenability of these systems to gold extraction. I mean, the scale, the continuity, and the metallurgy all come together to work at Fort Knox, and they make it work so that you can basically just dig out this 0.3 gram per ton rock and over to profit. So it's pretty incredible to see, and it's very encouraging to then find a system that has multiples of those grades.
Yes, indeed. And I get so you have these narrow veins, but they're all over the place, as I understand it. And I know that you've shown to your investors there are drill holes that had a lot of visible gold, and those things, I mean, that's the area where you really have the higher grades. So may understand the potential economics here. You're very near or at surface, essentially. And as I look at this, the geometry or the way it sits in the ground it would seem to be very low stripping ratio, potentially, at least to start with, for quite a while, potentially. I mean, we're talking way ahead of time here. I know you've got a lot of work to do yet before this comes into focus. But maybe you just comment about the economic potential, and I underscore the word potential. There's a lot of work that needs to be done yet. What about metallurgy? Have you done metallurgical work yet? I think you have some.
Yeah, we're actually just nearing completion on that. So I don't know when viewers are watching this, but I encourage anyone to go and check out our website for the latest updates there. I'll share my screen here quickly, because I think some of the talking points. Can you see the slide with the plan map and the section on the right?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so just a quick recap here. This is this on the left, plan map. This red pink blob is the intrusion itself, and there's kind of a subzone within that where these colors represent different grades, with pink being greater than 2 grams per ton. You can see some pretty big multi-100 meter continuous or nearly continuous sections that have a lot of pink or dominated, like in that top 108 meters that I mentioned of hole 10 over here. I think there were 72% of the samples are above 2 grams per ton. So it's just really nice, consistent mineralization. And it's not like there are a lot of high flying assays that are smeared out like you see in various gold systems. It's really nice, continuous stuff. If you apply a cap at 10 grams per ton in this 318 meters at 2.55 grams, it drops to 2.35 grams per ton. So it's really, it's almost within rounding error of what it was. And then again, speaking of the economics of it, you can see this zone in kind of the western half of the intrusion is where the best mineralization is. And the best mineralization, when you look at this cross section here, going from A to A prime, you can really start to imagine, what a pit might look like. Obviously, as you say, there's a lot more work to do. We have a lot of geotechnical engineering and so on to do, and not to mention just drilling. But even with a fairly conservative pit slope, you can basically take out this high grade without much for strip ratio or dilution at all. And so, that's pretty exciting to see. And it's like that as you go along this whole section. As I mentioned, it's in a big, broad, flat valley bottom. So while it is in mountainous country in general, the actual location of this couldn't be much better than it is.
Interesting.
That speaks very well. And again, you dig into that, that first shovelful, and you're digging into 100 meters, at least of 4 gram per ton material there. And who knows what's around it? We intend to find out this year, but these are fairly aggressive spaces on the drill plan. So there's a lot left to find out. But the continuity does do a lot for us as explorers. We've drilled 12,000 meters total into the target so far. And you can see a lot of that was getting fairly adventurous, trying to figure out what the real size of the envelope is here. So I don't have the exact number, but call it 7,000 or 8,000 meters into the actual system itself. And already what's there is really starting to take shape on the back of a lot of envelopes. And we have our envelopes out as well, of course. And those numbers are starting to converge to some pretty healthy figures. And we're certainly happy with what we're seeing there. But the end result is getting us to a proper resource will take a lot less drilling than it would in another sort of a system. You see, for example, just because I have the figures in mind, a Great Bear drilled about 300 or 350,000 meters, and Kinross subsequently drilled another 100 or 200,000 more. So they came out with their initial resource with about 500,000 meters of drilling. Here, it'll probably take, I don't want to pin it down exactly because we need to figure out what the edges of the system are, but on the order of 20 to 25,000 meters of total drilling. So it's a very different beast, and so that helps with exploration, but it also helps when it comes to mining. When you're just mining and you're not worried about dilution, you're not worried about optimizing different things. I mean, hopefully you're going to be optimizing various things, but you don't have to. You basically just dig, and it's mineralization, and that helps at every step along the way. In terms of upgrading your resources, mine planning, actual production, and so on. So the continuity, just like at Fort Knox, is a great asset here. And just speaking quickly to the metallurgy, as I mentioned, we'll have quantitative results in hand very soon, if not already by the time various people get to this. But what we're seeing qualitatively is encouraging. It's what we want to see for gold deportment in the rocks. This is just a cut section from some of the drill core in, I think it was hole 7. And you can see gold is occurring as native gold primarily, and it's primarily along grain boundaries. It's in these quartz veins. Like if you look at the mineralization here, it basically looks like a granite countertop. Like it's really boring rock, unless you're excited by granite, then it's very exciting rock. But it's cut by these quartz veins, as I mentioned, and you can see the dark background in this figure is quartz. And in those quartz veins, you see here and there just little tiny specks of this gray material, and those are bismuth and tellurium sulfides and really alloys. And associated with those is visible gold. So you often see little specks, and we're lucky for gold explorers to be able to look at our core, and by looking at both the vein densities, how many of those quartz veins there are, because the granite itself is just granite. Well, it's granodiorite, but it doesn't really have much for mineralization in it. So it really comes down to the quartz veins. And if you have more quartz veins, you have more gold. But then you also have to look and make sure that those quartz veins are carrying those little specks of bismuthinite and other minerals and visible gold. But if you can combine those two, the vein density and the visible gold, then you're in a very good place. You're in ore, and well, I shouldn't say ore, but good mineralization. And we'll see how the assays for this year's drilling come back, but we're already into some really nice looking stuff as we outlined in a recent release.
So you've started drilling already, Scott?
We have, yeah.
Yeah, and you're seeing some core already.
Yeah, we drilled in and very quickly got into some nice mineralization. Our first hole was just north of hole 7 here, and to the south east of hole 29 that you can see. That hole itself was about the height of CN Tower in mineralization, 558.7 meters at 1.6 grams from surface. And yes, we're drilling right there, and we actually got into good mineralization higher in the hole than we were expecting to, which is great to see, and some really spectacular visual results. Anyway, we'll have to await the assays to see how significant it really is, but the amount of visible gold we've seen in that hole is so far second only to our hole 10, which had 120 instances in the upper 300 or so meters of the hole. This one has like 106. So we'll see. It could just depend on the kind of morning the logging geologist is having, how much gold they're spotting in the core. It's a bit of a subjective measure, but we'll get those analytical results, and we're certainly happy with what we're seeing so far.
So you have this high grade section that we're looking at on the map there. And then on the right, we're looking at a cross section of a portion of that from A to A prime. So you can start drill. I mean, it seems to me that early on, if you can start bringing out some of that high grade stuff, it really helps the net present value of this investment.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that's the really nice thing about this system. Is the highest grades are right near surface. This hole 29 you can see in the cross section, we actually targeted, because these veins are basically vertically oriented. We were thinking when we drilled hole 10, okay, well, let's just chase this down. How deep does it go? At those kind of grades, you know, something like block cave could work in this kind of a system. So let's see if we can hit it at 500 meters below surface and see what happens down there. And so we drilled down there, and by that metric alone, it was a little bit disappointing. You can see the grades. There are grades down here, but they're generally, they're not the big 4 gram per ton stuff up near surface. But what we did find is the high grade zone continuing near surface. And we see that across in different sections across here too. And so that's ultimately a better result. It's not quite what we were aiming for, but if we're going to find high grade somewhere, better to find it near surface. So ultimately, yeah, that improves the economics. If you're digging into 4 grams per ton or whatever the ultimate average grade in that area turns out to be, that's going to pay off your capital expenditures a lot more quickly than if that's just your, if you're chasing that to great depths to try to get to that kind of mineralization. It's a great setup for a potential mine. For sure.
And then as I look at the lower grades out to the north, to the east, northeast, southeast there, you've done some you put some drill holes down there. I'm looking at 161 meters of, well, that's not that bad, 1 gram. I don't know, some of those other lower grade holes that aren't in the high grade sections still look like grades that are similar to Fort Knox, even the lower grades. So I would think that, obviously when this gets mined out sometime in the future, you're going to be hitting that high grade stuff first, getting your capital returned, and then, but you could have a very long mine life here, mining in later years, lower grade stuff, I would imagine, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see what the cutoff grades ultimately come to be. But I agree. I think that a lot of this stuff, you look at like this hole down here, and I suppose there's amount of relativity to all of this, where these holes just are kind of blinding in their grade and continuity, and you come out to something like this, and even 201 meters at 0.37, that could well be ore. We'll find out, but as you're pushing the pit wall back, especially if you're getting higher grade stuff in there, it could well be that stuff goes onto a leach pad and is processed that way, and it's you're breaking even on it, but you're not it's not just rock that you have to move. It's not gang or waste rock.
Right. Interesting. Well, certainly, what do you expect to accomplish this year? Do you have more slides to show?
There are a lot of slides. We don't have to go through the whole deck here, but yeah.
If you have some more things you'd like to show us
let me just zoom out a little bit.
Yeah. I want to ask you about Gracie for sure, but
yeah. So Valley is part of the picture, and I mentioned when we started out that Rogue itself is basically a 30 by 60 kilometer feature, and it has a ton of these little intrusions. And some of them come to surface like Valley, some of them don't quite poke through, like an intrusion a few miles to the east called Gracie. And we know this there from the geophysics, the geochemistry, even in a satellite cutaway, you can basically, and we don't know exactly where the intrusion is, so that's just a cartoon, but the satellite imagery is real, and you can see that red gossiness ridge, and that's Hornfels alteration. It's a very high temperature, low pressure alteration type. And so that tells you that something cooked this rock, and no intrusion right around it, but the geophysics shows there's something nearby just under it. And so we're seeing really good geochemistry on surface there. We're seeing the same kind of veins that hold the mineralization at Valley, but when you get out of the intrusion at Valley, those densities drop right off. And again, it's all about the vein density, just because the surrounding rock isn't carrying much gold. And so, and by density, I mean number of veins per meter, not necessarily the weight of the vein. And it's the same thing here, where we drilled a small phase 1 program last summer, 2022, and we hit those veins in 4 of the 5 holes, and we hit the visible gold in those veins, but at densities of a vein every 2 meters or a vein every meter or so, and it wasn't quite what we need to have it hang together and produce that kind of ore. But we also did not hit the intrusion. The side effect of the big step outs we took at Valley and the drilling that we did even outside of the intrusion is now we have a little bit of a roadmap and a case study for, we know what a beautiful deposit of this type looks like in this area, and we have good multi-element geochemistry and so on. We can use that and the mineralogy of the rocks themselves to vector towards where the intrusion is, and within the intrusion where the highest grades are. And so we're aiming to do that at Gracie. We're testing a few different ideas, and we'll have a phase 2 drill program there. And then just stepping out even further here, just looking regionally, we have a huge land position out in the eastern Selwyn Basin. The Selwyn Basin is a geological analog to the Great Basin in Nevada in many ways. It was deposited off the same coast of North America at the same time. It's since rotated up off the equator, where both Nevada and the Yukon were about 500 million years ago. And it's settled into place in the Yukon, but unlike Nevada, it hasn't seen a couple centuries of prospectors. This area, particularly in the north of our region, has seen essentially no exploration prior to us moving in there. So it's pretty exciting. Both the Jupiter discovery that we made early on and Valley were made by walking up creeks and actually seeing the mineralization sticking out of the ground. It was float in the case of Jupiter. In the case of Valley, there are mineralized outcrops there that a prospector named Shane Carlos came in for a company that we'd optioned these claims out to, and chip sampled, I think it was 4.7 grams over 4 meters. And you go up and you see the edge of the intrusion, and you see these beautiful veins. And yeah, so all that to say that we have a lot of ground left to explore here. Valley is the tip of the iceberg. It shows that this region is fertile. That was the idea that we launched the company around. And so we're thinking sort of district scale here. We're not really thinking, well, we are now that we found Valley specifically, and we don't want to stay distracted and lose focus on that. But we also don't want to forget why we launched the company, which is this potential for basically globally significant gold province in the eastern Yukon, in an area that's been historically overlooked. And to go out and in season 2 define something like Valley, I mean, we don't have a resource there yet, but we're on our way. But something of that scale with those kind of grades, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better proof of concept. So we're pretty excited by the whole district. And this season we'll be doing not just drilling to advance Valley, but drilling to test a lot of these other targets that we've identified as well.
Yeah, Gracie, how much will you do at Gracie this year? And what about the rest of your targets? So you just recently picked up some more ground. Is that gold and oily yours?
It is ours, yeah. So the different colors on this map are different projects that we have in the area. And you're right, we both acquired these a few postage stamps within the project, and then after that staked everything else. And so essentially we have this entire district locked down, or this entire geological feature. We'll be allocating roughly 2,000 meters of drilling, 2,000 or more, to Gracie in a phase 2 program to follow up on those results. The next intrusion over to the east, which we've been calling Reed or LM, we'll be drilling a phase 1 program there. That actually has some really interesting historical results that got us into the area initially as prospectors in 2008. And there's a hole there that reported 2 grams per ton over 96 meters. It's influenced by a couple of high-grade zones within it, but nonetheless, there's a good continuous body of mineralization there within another intrusion. So this was a third intrusion along that little trend with Valley, Gracie, and Reed. And yeah, that was in one of the postage stamps, or partially in one of the postage stamps that we've acquired. And it was something that caught our attention as prospectors back in 2008. My father dragged me out here, and I was fresh off my geology degree, and really we've been looking to advance this district ever since. So to finally get to drill it and to have these kind of results come together, and to have the big discovery, not even on the intrusion that caught our attention in the first place, is a great turn of events.
So you just put out a press release a couple of days ago talking about an 80% increase in your land position. What's that all about, Scott?
That's really about consolidation of that district. And here, I'll just pull that release up actually to show anyone watching a map and save them the trouble. But ultimately, in recognizing what Valley is, and in recognizing that proof of concept, it made a lot of sense for us to pull the trigger on securing everything else in that district. And we had a really good position that we were comfortable with, but you don't know what you don't know. And just to have everything is a lot cleaner. So here's the map from press release late last week. And you can see that was the claim position we were just looking at. The yellow is the new staking. And not only have we picked up those postage stamps within it, but we picked up basically everything. And so, and I say we don't know what we don't know, because Valley itself is an intrusion that doesn't show up on any geological map. If you were to just go in there, as was done earlier, and pick up a few of the most obvious small intrusions, you would have missed it altogether. And so we don't know where the other valleys are yet, but we're doing a lot of regional baseline work. And so this allows us to systematically and iteratively explore this area, and that ultimately makes it a lot more likely that we'll find what's there. So the fact that we can do that, the fact that we can use what we've learned at Valley and apply it everywhere else in this district, I think puts us in a very strong position.
Indeed. I'm wondering, Scott, are you expecting, I think I heard you say quantitative as well as qualitative. Are you intending to put out a resource sometime in the near future? Because as you say, it takes a lot less drilling to do that in this type of deposit than some of the others. On the other hand, there's the one school of thought, I'm sure you've thought about this and talked about it with your board and all, that sometimes it's better not to do a resource or publish a resource too early, because then the market says, oh, this is what they've got. And there could be a heck of a lot more there yet. So what are your plans? Are we going to see a resource anytime soon? Or is it something that maybe just the geos that can peer into this story and understand what you really got? Let's say the big guys that have the money. What are your plans?
Yeah, we're driving aggressively towards a resource, but I agree with that assessment that you don't want to just come out with a resource that's part of what you have and then go from there. And even a resource could be a little bit misleading in that even if we have a very nice resource for Valley, if we're making good progress on these other targets and we put out a resource for Valley, the rest of the targets could quickly be forgotten, and Snowline just becomes that one number. But so what we don't want to do is to go out to Valley and drill part of it and have a huge open section that we're pointing to with those arrows that you see in all these in these releases and so on. We want to come out with a holistic picture of what's there, and we'll weigh in kind of what we're finding on those other projects as well, which at that point would be pre-resource. But we'll see how far this season gets us. It's conceivable that it could get us there with the drilling that we're doing, yeah, it really depends on the distribution of the mineralization and how much we can get done.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly have to ask you about B2 Gold. They come in, I think, 5% initially in a private placement maybe, and then they're starting to buy more shares in the market up to, I think it's 9.9%. So what is the relationship with B2 Gold? Because they are obviously a successful producer. They must be seeing something they're liking to see there.
Yeah, the relationship is cordial. They're a strong investor to have, and a strong vote of confidence in the in the project as it stands. So there's no real formal relationship apart from them being a 9.9% shareholder, and they do have a participation right at that level, but they in exchange for that they've agreed with a vote with management or vote with the board provision. So yeah, it's a position that we're very happy to see, essentially, where it doesn't really give them that leverage of trying to influence the outcome of a outside bid in any way. They're kind of tied themselves to the mast in that regard, but they're clearly very interested in what we're doing out here, and after acquiring 5%, decided that was not enough and doubled down. So yeah, they've built some mines or some very profitable mines in some great places and not so great places, I suppose, depending on your perspective. And so it's it's encouraging to see them jump on this. And interestingly, one of their senior geologists who recently left the company started his career out in the Rogue Plutonic Complex, working with an energy company that was assessing those intrusions for uranium, one of the very few programs that was done there historically. And he found tons of gold, and he wrote some good reports that I was using early on in prospecting out there. And I guess the company wasn't that interested in the gold out there, and the uranium wasn't off the charts, and so they moved on to the next thing. And those reports have just been sitting there, and I'm sure it's been on the back of his mind for the past few decades of his career. So it's interesting bookends there, and a nice little sub story to the whole ordeal.
Very interesting. So are you able to talk to their technical people as well, Scott, you and your team? Do you trade ideas from time to time?
We're open to technical advice from anybody. There's no like formal technical committee or anything like that.
Yeah,
but yeah, we're certainly not afraid of reaching out to majors and asking what do you think? What would you do? What would you want to see? That kind of a thing. And that's been really informative across the board.
Right. Excellent. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess in terms of investors, share price drivers, the drills are turning. You might have some assays. How soon?
Yeah. Knock on wood. We've submitted our first samples to the assay lab, and we've taken some steps to improve the turnaround times from last year. So if all goes well, it's conceivable that we could see assay results in July, and hopefully at the very latest by August. And then they're going to come fast, because we're doing a lot of work out there and doing a lot of drilling. So we're going to have we're going to be a very different company, I think, by the time this field season ends versus where we are right now.
Ah, interesting. Very interesting. Well, it's very exciting. I'm so glad that you joined us, Scott. This is such an exciting story. I must say that it is personally my largest holding. There's some other great companies out there too, but this is one of the best and one of the most exciting exploration stories that I've encountered over the years. And I did enjoy Great Bear. It was a nice run, but this looks at least as good, I think. Well, time will tell. It's very exciting. So anything else you'd like to add before we conclude our discussion?
No, I think we did a great job covering things there, and I'll let your viewers get on to your main attraction.
Well, I don't know. Those that stick around and listen to what you just said, you may be the main attraction, or Snowline may be. David Stockman is very well known. He's our next guest, folks. So don't go away. We'll be right back with David, and he'll talk about the most recent budget, U.S. government's budget that, we'll see what his thoughts are on that. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. I'm really pleased to tell you that David Stockman is with us once again. This time to provide his analysis of the McCarthy budget, which has now been signed into law. Welcome, David, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be with you. And when it comes to analysis of the McCarthy budget, I think you can make short shrift of it. It was a travesty. I think people know that by now. But it's worth going into some of the details and some of the context or background, because I think it reminds us about how serious, really serious, deadly serious, this whole fiscal problem really is.
Yeah, David, let me just, I looked up what is the responsibility of the Office of Management and Budget, which is you headed up that group. It's supposed to be the highest, I think the largest office underneath the executive branch, and they say it is to support the president's budget. That is to be. It sounded like almost your job was to be a puppet for the president to make sure that he got his budget through, almost as if it was a political task. And I guess by definition, when you're in the executive, you can't divorce yourself from politics. But I sort of think that wasn't the way you viewed your job when you were there. Do I have that right? I mean, after all, there was all over the headlines, all over the news about the president having to take you out back to the woodshed and give you a good whooping.
Yeah.
I mean, that was always stupid to me. I could never believe that President Reagan would be like that.
Yeah.
But
But
go ahead.
Sure. Great questions. There's a lot of mythology from then and now. I guess today, maybe that's what the OMB director does, support the president's budget, because it's become so political and so fanciful that it's hard for a real professional to support not just the budget that Biden has put out, but the Trump budgets were just as bad.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the record, Trump had the biggest spending record of any president in the last half century. The budget in real terms grew by 11.5% a year under Trump, which was about 4 or 5 times the average of the previous 70 years, Republicans and Democrats all thrown together. So, that was today. Back then, we got into office in 1980. The people wanted a sweeping change. They were tired of Carter. They were tired of big government. We had high inflation. The economy was sputtering. And so Reagan basically committed to an across-the-board tax cut, but said he would balance the budget too, and that he would come up with a program to do that. He didn't have a list of cuts that he was going to make in the campaign. He said, we'll tell you about that once we get elected. So all of a sudden, I get the job. We have about 4 weeks to come up with literally tens of billions, hundreds of billions of cuts and savings and reforms in order to match against the big revenue loss that would occur from the tax cut and from the substantial defense buildup. So back in those days, the OMB was the financial switchboard of the federal government. The agencies came, to our offices. We didn't go to theirs, on bended knee, hoping we wouldn't cut too deeply into the bone of their operation. So the world has changed a lot, but here's the takeaway from it. We were struggling with that first budget. This is in February 1981, to keep the current year deficit low enough so that the national debt wouldn't go over $1 trillion. Back in the day, that seemed like a real red line. That seemed like, a real crossing point that we dare not traverse. Well, here we are. It's only, 40 years later, the debt is 32 trillion, but that's not the real debt. That's the notional debt today. It doesn't include the unfunded liabilities of all these giant entitlements, and it doesn't, encompass what's built in, sort of baked into the cake with these automatic entitlements that will take the deficit into the 2 trillion plus range year after year as far as the eye can see. So my approach to it is to say, until someone shows us differently by putting legislation on the table to change mandatory spending, to change entitlement spending, to find some way to dismantle this massive defense budget and global empire that Washington is trying to run. Until that is done, and clearly it isn't being done, it wasn't done in this latest battle, that was all just a lot of fakery. But until it's done, we really need to essentially project forward the built-in spending, the built-in revenue under current law, and ask where it gets us. And the answer is, according to CBO, 20 trillion of more debt over the next decade. According to me, because I think CBO is rosy scenario, way too
Yeah.
optimistic. No recession, inflation goes away in a couple of years. Interest rates go up a little bit, but not much. A lot of revenue increases that are built into the budget happen. They won't. They'll get deferred at the last minute. Same way with spending cuts. Anyway, I say it's 25 trillion built in. If we sit on our hands, that's what's going to happen. And of course, that's exactly what happened during this so-called fight over the debt ceiling. The White House sat on its hands, proposed some trivial little cuts. The Republicans passed, a kind of flaky bill in April, but it did cut something. They negotiated for a few days and came up with nothing. And I think it's important to go through, if you want to negotiate with someone and have a good prospect of coming out ahead, I would say try to negotiate with Kevin McCarthy because he was cancellation, for instance, of Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. Good move. That would have saved $320 billion, and we shouldn't be canceling all those loans, especially to people who are going to be in the upper part of the income scale anyway in their working life. All right. The bill they passed in the House would have saved over $500 billion over a decade by canceling all these green energy credits, for solar and wind and electric vehicles and so forth. Total nonsense, complete waste of money, distortion of energy markets and so forth. At least the House Republicans repealed all that. It would have saved $500 billion over a decade. They went to negotiating with Biden. They came back with zero. Okay. So they came back with zero savings on the student debt forgiveness, zero savings on the energy credits. And then they at least tried to do a little something on entitlements. Now, here's the picture for entitlements. Over the next decade, entitlements and mandatory spending, which means if Congress doesn't do something, it'll just spend out under current law. The cost of entitlements over the next decade is $48 trillion.
Wow.
The House Republicans left everything untouched. No Social Security, no Medicare, no changes in SSI, federal retirement. You could go on. But at least they tried to increase the work requirement this is now only able-bodied adults who don't have minor children. So we're not throwing kids out in the snow. We're not picking on disabled people and so forth. This was able-bodied people. And they proposed, if you can get this, to change current law, which says if you're under 49 and in that category, you have to take a job. But if you're 51, you don't. Now, why the heck are we saying someone with no kids who's 51 years old and able-bodied doesn't have to work? He gets his Medicaid and he gets his food stamps and he gets a lot of other things. Anyway, at least the House Republicans had the gumption to raise that age where you have to work to 54. Now, that still isn't huge, right? But at least they raised it from 49 to 54. And they said that will be applied to Medicaid, it'll be applied to food stamps, and it'll be applied to family assistance. They go to conference and they negotiate like crazy allegedly with the White House staff. Now, of that proposal would have saved $130 billion over a decade from requiring at least, I think it was something like 700,000 people getting benefits today to work for those benefits. The biggest piece of that was Medicaid. Of the $130 billion, $110 billion came from applying the work requirement age increase to Medicaid. Biden said, no way. They came out of conference, savings, zero. Then they were going to apply it to food stamps. Or to family assistance. That was $10 billion of savings. They came out of conference, zero. Then they were going to apply it to food stamps, again, raising the age only from 49 to 54, that was going to save 10 billion. I guess they negotiated like crazy with the Democrats and with the Biden White House people, and they came back with, guess what? Not a goose egg, but a positive 2 billion.
Oh my goodness.
Instead of saving a dime, they actually liberalized the work requirement by exempting all veterans, all homeless people, all people that were on foster care, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Wow.
So on these three items, which were the only real things in the House passed bill, they got zero savings. They capitulated entirely to the White House. And what they ended up with is a lot of numbers games that make it look like they're saving a little bit when it's all voluntary except for the current year. In other words, they say they're going to save something like 1.3 trillion over 10 years from capping domestic discretionary spending. The thing is, though, the last 8 years are only aspirational. Those caps aren't binding. There's no enforcement mechanism. And we know from history they'll be totally ignored because 2 Congresses from now, they won't even remember that they set these targets. So my point is, if you go through it point by point, you can see that not only did the Republicans capitulate on anything that was meaningful, but actually they ended up with one, giant goose egg in terms of changing the trajectory of this out of control budget over the next 10 years. They kept talking about, you probably heard some of the Republicans say, well, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we bended the trajectory, didn't bend any trajectory. Yeah. The baseline deficit over the next decade is 25 trillion, and it still is. And therefore, what happened is they blew the opportunity. In other words, they had Biden over a barrel. They could have forced the Treasury beginning June 5th, which was a couple days ago. Yeah. They could have forced the Treasury to allocate the incoming revenue to the highest priorities, which would be interest on the debt, right, Social Security payments, military pay, maybe military operations, so you keep the ships sailing, the planes in the air, and so forth. They could have done all of that and then deferred spending for lesser priorities. There is no threat of default. That is the biggest boogeyman ever created in Washington. And it is not just my opinion. A lot of liberal constitutional scholars back in the day said, yes, if push comes to shove and you don't raise the debt ceiling, then you take the revenue that's coming into the Treasury and you allocate it to what you deem to be the most important or highest priorities until you can make an agreement to raise the debt ceiling. Now, that's what they should have done. And frankly, it's pretty pathetic that when push came to shove, they blinked, they flinched. Because again, I think none of this comes out in the daily press. No. The mainstream press doesn't want the people to know anything. Okay, they want you to think that there's going to be a debt default, some horrible, terrible thing. The credit of the United States will be ruined like some banana republic, and we'll all tumble into an economic black hole. Well, that's totally ridiculous. And I'll give just one or two facts, which never came out in all of this coverage you got day after day in the mainstream press. On average, for the last few months of this fiscal year that we're in now, so this is real, current, where we are, there's 450 billion of revenue coming into the Treasury month after month after month. You know what the average interest payment is per month? 60 billion, 13%. So you could easily pay the interest from the incoming revenue even if you couldn't borrow a dime on Uncle Sam's credit card. Now, you could say, well, okay, you could cover the interest. Well, what about Social Security? That's 130 billion a month. So with 450 billion of revenue coming in, you got more than enough cash flow to pay that. Well, what about military pay? We have to pay the servicemen, right? And keep the planes flying and ships sailing and all that. How much is that? 50 billion. Okay, so we got room for that. Well, what about the veterans? After all, there's a lot of disabled veterans or veterans that have had a tough time in life. They serve the country. How do we pay their pensions? Well, we do. It's 50 billion. There's still plenty a month. There's still plenty of revenue for that. So my point is that you could easily cover the debt service, 13%. You could cover all of these other items or whatever priorities you wanted, and you would still have damn near 200 billion left to pay maybe half of everything else. That's what they should have done, because there is no default. There is only deferrals. There is only, what happens in the business world. The company gets in trouble and they try to shove some bills in the drawer until they can, get back on their feet and get revenue and spend outlays matched. That's what should have been done here. And it's not, I'm not trying to do just they should have done it here. What I'm really trying to say is that the truth is there is no risk of debt default, period, full stop, none, nix, nada. Right. And they keep perpetuating this myth. And of course, the Wall Street Journal's happy to reprint it, and CNN or CNBC and the Washington Post and the Times and all the rest of them, like some chorus, that we're going to default, we're going to default. It's not even remotely true, but they use it to scare the public. And then the politicians lose their nerve, even the Republicans, because they think the public will turn against them for defaulting, which will never happen. And so we just go on year after year. Every couple of years, we have a debt ceiling fight crisis. Nothing happens. The corporal's guard of politicians that want to reduce spending and put a limit on the debt, get outmaneuvered, get outfoxed, out-negotiated, and we raise the debt ceiling yet again. Right. So that's how we got from 1 trillion when I was there to 32 trillion at the present, going to 55 trillion before, they blink about 4 more times in the next decade. So that's kind of, in some summary, the dire nature of this whole, I call it the, doomsday, the fiscal doomsday machine, because it really is. It's just cranking away. And, the only way to stop it is with the debt ceiling. Now, you could say, use the normal machinery of Congress. Don't try to take the debt ceiling hostage. You hear all this righteous talk about, well, we incurred the bills, we have to pay them and all this. Yeah. But the point is that would be fine and dandy if we passed a budget every year. They haven't passed a budget in decades. Yeah. That would be fine if they passed the 12 regular appropriations bills for defense and non-defense every year, but they never do. They wait till the 2 days after the fiscal year starts, they pass a continuing resolution. That lasts a month, and eventually they pass a huge omnibus bill in the middle of the night, covering all the appropriations for the entire federal government in 3,000 pages that nobody has read, and that's laced with pork and special interest wasteful projects. So I guess my point is that if the whole system is broken and the fiscal mechanisms, the fiscal governance process is totally broken, then the only tool you have left is to take the debt ceiling hostage, refuse to raise it, let the other side blink, the permanent government, the deep state, the career politicians, the spenders, from both parties, and maybe you can get a little bit of leverage to change, to truly change the trajectory of this, credit card based government policy.
Yeah. Well, David, I'm wondering if, I mean, obviously for political reasons, the Republicans certainly don't have most of the media, if much of any of it, on their side. So as soon as some park rangers lose their job, or not lose their job, as soon as they don't get paid for a couple of weeks, then that's a default in the minds of a lot of people, right? They're not talking about a default like you're talking about. The people don't get paid on their interest and the U.S. Treasury can't pay. That's a real default. There would be, as you say, and thank you so much for explaining all that. I haven't seen those kind of details. Larry Kudlow told me it was just fine. So I mean, you know Larry Kudlow pretty well. I think what I've heard on Fox, he thought, well, it wasn't everything, but it was pretty good. And, we did best we could. So it seems like, it's a blame game. It's all political, isn't it? Like who's going to get hurt politically is all they care about. And as I recall, you were willing to go to the woodshed if necessary to stand up for what you believed. And that's why I've always had such a high regard for you, because I think you're an honest broker, and you didn't stay in politics that long, probably because of that.
Yeah.
So
But even there, you have to give President Reagan a little credit, because I I put this in my book a long time ago. I wrote a book, a memoir, sort of when I left the White House, 1986. But this whole thing about the woodshed gets stuck in the journalistic archives. Okay.
Yes.
And so they just keep repeating it. But what I explained in the book, and President Reagan, if he were with us today, would agree, that when this big article came out in the Atlantic Monthly, quoting me as saying, we don't know what's going on with the numbers and a lot of things, it was all out of context. But there was such a firestorm at the time, this was 1981, that the politicians around President Reagan in the White House said, you can't let this stand. You've got to have Stockman come into your office, and you've either got to fire him or give him a good dressing down, because he has really screwed things up. So I get a call from the chief of staff, which was then Jim Baker, and he said, you better get your sorry rear end, except he didn't use the word rear end. He used the other word. Over to the Oval Office. You're having lunch with the president. No one else is going to be there, and you better explain to him where all these comments came from, or you're going to be your tenure is going to be short-lived. So I got there, and he said, Dave, why did you undercut the administration? Why did you betray me? I said, well, I didn't. I said, everything that I said to this reporter, is the editorial page reporter for the Washington Post, was off the record, absolutely. And I was basically, giving him some insight as to what we were doing so that we would get better coverage on the front page. So it was a deal we had made. And basically, so I wasn't, parsing my words. I wasn't, because it was all off the record. Anyway, he double-crossed me, printed it all. And I explained all this to President Reagan. He said, he said, that reminds me when I was president of the Screenwriters Guild. And I had a off-the-record interview once with a reporter for the Hollywood Reporter or something, and he did the same thing to me. And so all of a sudden, he was totally sympathetic, understood. And here's the punchline of this whole story. He said, well, okay, I understand, no problem. Let's go back to work. Let's keep up the good fight and all of that. But the fellas, that's what he called, Deaver and Meese and Baker, three guy Troika that ran the staff.
Yes.
They think I've got to do something to show that you're being disciplined and that I'm a strong leader. And I said, okay. And I said, okay, and it just crossed my mind at the moment. I grew up in Michigan on a farm, and there was an old thing down on the farm where if you had misbehaved, your father could take you to the woodshed after supper. Okay. So I said, well, why don't we say you took me to the woodshed after supper? How would that be? Maybe that was. He said that's great. would you say that in a press session after we finish here? I said, yeah, sure. That's a good metaphor. I'll say that. So I did. And here we are, I guess 40
Yeah,
years later, and it's still in the press morgue. It's still in
yeah,
the archive, but it never even happened, you know. But I think it's a good illustration of the difference between what actually happens and
hmm,
what ends up being in the so-called mainstream press
right,
narrative over time.
right. Well, with regard to our Republican representatives, they couldn't hold tough. I mean, they had to buckle. I guess they're looking to see. They want to make sure they get reelected. I guess there's enough of them that are putting that first above all else. And it's. But I mean, let's get to what this all means now, David, for the economy, because the Democrats, of course, would like to raise taxes. And of course, they're trying to say it's all the rich guys that are going to pay it. That's a lot of baloney. We know that doesn't happen. Most people that are, that have lots and lots of money have it hedged one way or another. I mean, they're offshore or they've got it. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways, municipals or whatever. I mean, they can try to tax capital away, right, and give it to the government. But anyway, the point is we're going to be heading for some huge deficits that have to be funded. And there once upon a time was we could rely on the net exporters around the world to buy our treasuries, but those guys aren't too friendly to us anymore. China and Japan is an aging population. They don't have excess money to be buying U.S. treasuries and all that. It seems like, where's it going to come from other than the printing press? Or do you see, I mean, a Democratic administration is going to probably start to just tax the heck out of us, right?
Well, those are all great questions, and I think they point to the real bind that we're in. First, yeah, we got a lot of help for a while from China and other foreign states, jurisdictions that were buying the debt. But that's overdone. That's old. That's an old story.
Yeah.
There's some information out today. Currently, China is now holding only about 850 billion of U.S. debt,
Mm-hmm.
and that's down from 1.3 trillion only 4 or 5 years ago. So, if we look at it at the turn of the century, they had maybe 100 billion of treasury debt. They ran that up to 1.3 trillion. That made it easy to run all those big deficits year after year during Bush and during Obama and during Trump. But finally, when we basically said, you're on the bad guys list, and you have all these people in Washington huffing and puffing about how bad China is, they said, okay. And when they saw what happened to Russia, where we froze all of their assets, 700 billion that were on deposit at various central banks, including the Fed, they said, we're not going to hang around to find out what shoe is going to fall next. So they've been selling off their treasury holdings, and I think they'll continue. They might even accelerate. That's a little piece of the story, but it's only a small piece. The big piece is the Fed has been monetizing massive amounts of of debt, treasury debt, and other central banks have followed suit. So it wasn't just the Fed, it was sort of the Fed leading a cavalcade or convoy of global central banks buying up government securities, but especially issues by the U.S. Treasury. Now, why is that not going to change? The answer is they unleashed a pretty potent inflation as a result of, when you monetize debt, you're creating credit out of thin air. You inject it into the bond pits when you buy back when you buy up all the treasuries, which is, really what the Fed does when it's conducting monetary policy. And that, for the time being, creates an illusion that you can have the Treasury borrowing $2 trillion a year and interest rates can stay low or even ultra low. Well, that game is over as well. The Fed basically had to end QE, quantitative easing. That really was the name they gave to printing money, to monetizing the debt. They, thought it would sound more credible. But they're done. They're actually now having to slowly pay down or reduce the 9 trillion of holdings that they had as recently as 7 or 8 months ago. So they're actually now disgorging about 95 billion, excuse me, a month of treasury holdings that they built up during this crazy money printing spree that they went on after the COVID hit. You know, at the time COVID hit, the balance sheet of the Fed was 4 trillion. It had taken them over a decade, or over a century to get there. You know, they opened in 1914. Now this was 2020, so it's 106 years. They got to 4 trillion. They were 9 trillion. You know, in a matter of like 15, 16 months after the COVID hit, they printed like crazy. That's what created these enormous inflationary bubbles that we're struggling with right now. But even they have realized they needed to stop. They did in March of 2022, a year ago. And as a result of that, the Treasury, the Fed is not absorbing the debt anymore. So the debt now and China isn't buying it. And the other central banks are being forced to shrink their balance sheets as well, because when the Fed shrinks, they have to, or their currencies are going to collapse. So all of the, let's say, false purchase of all that treasury debt that was being issued by foreign central banks, the People's Bank of China, ECB, the rest of them, and the Fed, all of that is coming to an end, which means that if we're going to run 2 trillion deficits a year, which is the run rate right now, it's over 2 trillion, that it will have to be funded in the bond pits out of real savings.
Wow.
From either household, and as we all know, the savings rate is at rock bottom lows. There isn't any savings because savers have been punished over and over, savaged, I say, by zero interest rates or near zero interest rates for years and years. So if you have no savings, if the central banks are out of the money printing business, if foreigners are no longer buying the debt, I think we're in a totally new ballgame. And as a result of that, what we experienced over the last few weeks with this so-called debt ceiling crisis, that was just like a warm-up. That was spring training for the real problems that are going to come, because all of this treasury borrowing is now going to crowd out private borrowers, mortgage borrowers, business borrowers, household borrowers. It will drive up interest rates, and then maybe we'll get a better balance of forces in the Washington fiscal equation. Back in the day when I was budget director, there was a strong anti-deficit constituency in Congress. And you might, shake your head today and say, what happened to them? Where did all the, where did all the deficit hawks go? The answer is the Fed euthanized them, right? In other words, back in those days, interest rates got pushed into double digits.
Yeah.
As I was a congressman from Michigan, and boy, when the Fed, when the Treasury borrowed too much money and interest rates got squeezed, you would hear from the local constituencies.
Sure.
Car dealers couldn't fund their lots. Small business wanted to borrow to expand. Households wanted mortgages, the whole thing. So you had enormous countervailing pressure coming from the local constituencies when the deficit was funded honestly in the bond pits. When they switched policy with Greenspan and everybody that came after him and funded the deficit at the Federal Reserve, that is to say, at the printing press, the whole dynamic changed.
Yeah.
Everybody that was for spending was still for spending. All the people that were against deficits didn't care because there was no consequence. There was no crowding out. there was no upward pressure on interest rates. So that's the real story. If you want to solve the debt problem, the deficit spending, you need to clean house at the Fed, get the Keynesian money printers out of there, let interest rates find their natural market clearing level, and it would do wonders to rekindle a little, fiscal rectitude in the legislative halls.
Right. Do you think Jay Powell, you think he's trying to do that? Daniel DiMartino Booth and yourself were the two people on this show that first made me aware that this isn't going to be a regular cycle here, that we're going to see much higher rates. And Powell seems to be hanging tough. Now I hear that, the Canadians just today, they're hiking their rates more than expected, and that even Christine Lagarde over there in Euroland is talking about raising rates some more. So is this a reality that these governments are saying, hey, if we're going to spend all this money, we got to finance it somehow. We can't keep printing because printing creates inflation.
Yeah.
And yet you wrote an article just recently suggesting that the inflation battle has just begun, I think was the title of your argument. So here I'm wondering, David, because rates are high, something is going to break. It seems like it started to with the bank out in the West Coast and some others. If something really bad breaks and we have another 2008, 2009 type of thing, what are they going to do? Are they going to go in there and start pumping money into the system like drunken sailors? Or do you think there's something that will keep them from doing that this time?
Yeah. Well, I hope not. And I guess the reason I still have faith that they'll kind of stick to their guns is that inflation got away from them.
Yeah.
We're totally surprised and shocked. At first, they were in denial.
Like the 1970s.
They said it was,
huh?
they said it was transitory. All of a sudden, it didn't prove to be transitory. Now it's proving to be very stubborn. Because if you just take a few of the factors that have provided a little relief in the last 3 or 4 months, basically gasoline prices and energy, the underlying core inflation accounts, the service accounts, wage accounts are still, going up 4, 5, 6%. So I think they now are in a different ball game where they know that the inflation is embedded, that it's been very stubborn, and they're not going to be in a position like they were in September 2008 to simply, pull out all the stops and flood the zone with massive expansion of their balance sheet. I do not think they'll do it. I don't think they can justify it. I think the thing is, they spent so long arguing that the 2% inflation target was sacred, right? It was like, I called it 2.00%. They were so, particular about that it was, and therefore, and during that period, by some measures, the inflation rate year over year was running slightly under 1.5, 1.7. And so they kept making the point, it's okay to have the throttle open in terms of the money printing that we're doing and interest rates being held, practically to the zero bound. It's okay to do that because inflation is actually under our target, and we actually are missing it from below. We need to have more inflation.
Yeah.
Remember, they gave a lot of speeches, Lagarde and many others of these central bankers, saying that we've got to. We're missing our target. We need more inflation. All right. So they expended so much credibility, so much political capital on this sacred 2% target that they're stuck with it. I think it should be zero, but at the present time, the 2% target is essentially doing God's work financially. That is, it's keeping their nose to the grindstone and putting, some stiffness in their spine that otherwise might not be there.
Right. So how high are interest rates going to have to go? I know you don't know the answer. Nobody does. Only God, if you believe in God, but no mere human can predict what the interest rates are going to be. How high are interest rates going to have to go for the United States to fund its debt? And I'm sure there's going to be things the Democrats are going to come through with. I'm sure there's going to be a yield curve control on the long end. They're going to try to do that. Wage and price controls, David. I mean, these people never learn. They'll try it again.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll
You
try
know,
to.
they may learn, but I'm a little more optimistic than that.
Good.
The experience from the 1970s was so bad. And that's when I started at Capitol Hill as a kid in the early 70s when Nixon put on wage and price controls.
Yes.
And it was a catastrophe. It was a disaster. And even Keynesian economists today who populate all the economics departments in the universities and colleges know that that was a disaster not to be repeated. So I don't think we're going to get wage and price controls. I think the Democrats are totally all over the lot when it comes to the Fed. So I don't think they're in any position to dictate to the mandarins who run the central bank what kind of policy to have. So it's going to be up to the groupthink of the Fed members and senior staff. And for the moment, their groupthink is we got to be serious about inflation, and that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. So, but the issue is, if we go back to the last significant inflation we had, the late 70s, when Volcker had to wrestle it down, he said when he took over in August 1979, he said, "This can't stand. We have an inflation rate of 12%, and we have a funds rate of 10%, which means that the interest rate in the money market is -2. We can never defeat inflation," Volcker said at the time, "if you have negative real interest rates. It will not happen." And he eventually pushed the real rate to positive 8 at its peak. Now, I don't think we're going to have to get to +8, but today inflation is still 6%, any way you measure it. The funds rate is 5%, it's still negative. And so I think they're going to have to overshoot to the upside, push nominal interest rates 6, 7, 8% in order to get positive real interest rates back into the market and some financial discipline. Then, if they don't get this deficit under control on the long end, all this Treasury borrowing is going to push rates higher and higher. So when you look at it today, it's crazy. Every day you can look at the charts and you can see, well, the 10-year U.S. Treasury is 3.5%. What kind of nonsense is that in a world in which the inflation rate is 6% or 7%? So that rate is going to go up. The short rate will go up a couple hundred basis points. The Treasury, the kind of benchmark rate that everything is based on, the 10-year U.S. Treasury, that's going to go up 300, 400 basis points very easily.
Yeah. Well, isn't the pain going to be a lot greater here, David? Though I saw the other day, somebody said, I don't know if it's right, you would know better than that source probably, but that over the next 2 years, the U.S. is going to have to roll over about half of its debt. And if that's the case, they're going to be rolling it over at much higher rates, the way it looks. And maybe that will project the fear of God into some of these congressmen and women, that maybe they'll start to look at, start to rediscover math and not fuzzy math, as Bush called it, I think, Bush Jr. They're going to discover that the reality of, the math just doesn't work with the way we're living beyond our means, $33 trillion. And we're, so maybe there is some optimism with some pain. And it just seems to me that we have to start allowing people to make something on their savings. There has to be some reason for people to want to save and not just consume all the time. And there's no reward for it. There hasn't been. So this is really a good thing. But I'm just wondering, don't you think the equity markets are still not believing? Don't you think? It seems to me they're believing that QE is going to be coming back, and we're going to have a real party again. Hang in there. The S&P doesn't seem to be wanting to roll over or take any kind of a serious hit. It hasn't gone anywhere in 2 years, but it doesn't seem to be. Nobody seems to be terribly fearful.
Yeah, because the Fed in the past has capitulated so many times when circumstances got difficult or tight, that there's kind of a built-in presumption on the part of all these younger people in the market that, well, when push comes to shove, the Fed will, flood the zone with liquidity. I think they're delusional. I think they're not assessing where we are, how we got here, and why the Fed has so few options except to stay the course. So, we'll find out. But I think the markets are wrong. But just think of it, during that period, just big spender Obama. Remember him? He left the White House in January 2017. The public debt was 19 trillion. Then we got Trump, and the public debt went to 28 trillion. Then we got Biden, and now it's up to 32. But in that short period, when the debt went from 19 to 32, the interest expense didn't rise very much because until a few months ago, the Fed had interest rates on the floorboard, and the Treasury debt was being financed heavily in the front end of the curve.
Yeah.
So you had trillions, actually, of 90-day bills, 6-month bills, 1-year bills, 2-year notes that were being financed at less than 0.5%.
Yeah, ridiculous.
But today, look where those rates are today. The bill rate is going to go way above 5% now that the Treasury's got a new debt ceiling, and they're going to be back in the market borrowing $1 trillion in the next couple of months to replenish their empty coffers. Now, my point is, when you're paying 5% for short-term money and the back end of the curve will eventually catch up, that creates $1 trillion annual interest cost versus $300 billion that they thought the politicians thought was normal a couple of years ago. And they're going to wake up, because when they find out, well, we can't, support our favorite charities or get more pork into the appropriations bills because interest expense is soaring, that will be, a useful wake-up call as well.
The day of reckoning is coming, no doubt about it. So the bottom line, just in summing up here, David, you see more inflation. The inflation isn't going to get down anytime soon, if I read you correctly. That means higher interest rates. So what's the investment ramifications for that view, assuming you're right on this, which I tend to agree with? But
well, in the short run, the ramification is stay out of the casino, because we're going to go through a big repricing. Stocks, I don't care which one you choose, or the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ 100, the whole basket of stocks is way overvalued because it was based on ultra low cap rates, which means the asset value can be pushed higher and higher. That's all going to change. The same thing is true on a Treasury debt. I mean, I don't know why you would buy the 10-year Treasury today when it's yielding only 3.5%, and the yield's going to go up, which means the price is going to go down. You will lose money on the principal unless you're investing until maturity, and a lot of people can't wait that long for one reason or another. Real estate is way overvalued, partly because we've got so much excess commercial real estate. What's happening with office space and so forth now. The malls, commercial real estate. But generally, when interest rates were pushed so low, that caused huge amounts of debt-based speculation in commercial real estate, drove prices sky high, and now we're going to have a reckoning, a price adjustment there as well. So the point is, stocks, bonds, and real estate don't look very attractive to me at this point. And the real answer is you have to stay in cash, because finally, short-term, liquid, safe securities like Treasury bills will generate something. Okay, you won't get rich. There will be no home runs. You won't double your money in 2 years, but it's a safe place to be while we go through this huge transition.
Yeah, short-term treasuries, and at some point, if they start to quantitative ease again, I imagine things like gold and silver might work okay. At
Yeah,
least,
yeah. Oh, I mean, I took for granted that people who don't trust central banks,
yeah.
I certainly don't, will always want to have a certain portion of their portfolio in gold or silver, because after all, that's real money. I mean, all the rest of this stuff is printed by the central banks.
Well, we'll have to leave it go at that. Thank you, David, for sharing your time so generously with us today. Next week, I'm hoping to have Michael Oliver back as a guest and possibly another guest or two as well. Until then, goodbye and God's blessings to you.
All financial advice provided on this show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. The financial ideas and strategies discussed are only provided as a starting point for a conversation about money matters. With regard to your particular investments and financial strategies, consult your financial planner, CPA, or investment professional. All your financial decisions are yours and yours alone to make, and subsequently are solely your responsibility. The information that is supplied through the context of the radio program and any repurposing of its content by the host or network is a combination and collection of solid financial investment understanding, opinion, and comments. This network, show, and its host are not liable for financial strategies, outcomes that you employ in any manner that result in any kind of loss. Shares of corporate sponsors may be the subject of buy or sell recommendations in Jay Taylor's newsletter in accordance with Jay's objective opinion.